In this next flowchart, we're going to expand upon an idea that we touched upon in our previous video, and that was the idea of phylogeny. More specifically, in what we'll entitle Classification 2, we're going to be looking at phylogenetic trees. And so we'll entitle this next flowchart Classification 2 with a subtitle of Phylogenetic Trees. And we'll look at these trees in a bit more detail. So, what are phylogenetic trees? Phylogenetic trees represent what we would consider a visual representation of a branching diagram. It's essentially going to be a diagram with a bunch of these branches. And as a branching diagram, this phylogenetic tree will not just be, a bunch of branches haphazardly and randomly put on a piece of paper. Instead, these branches are going to represent evolutionary history themselves. So these branches represents Evo for evolutionary history altogether. So it's a very powerful tool to look at something as important as evolutionary history. So, what can we do with these branches then? What can we do and understand from these branches and these trees that we draw? Well, we can understand and show patterns of descent first and foremost. The branching diagrams that we see or study show patterns of descent, where things came from, where they originated, and where they are now. Those are important patterns that evolutionary biologists, phylogeneticists really like to study and are powerful in telling us how we're so connected to the things previous that are currently either living or non-living, whatever it may be. These patterns of descent are defined and signified by the branches that we draw. Now, in addition, an important sort of caveat to this, something to note, is that these branches are not always going to be in line. So we'll say not always in line with what we would consider phenotypic similarities. This simply means that if we see two things that look similar, that seem to be, pretty much the same phenotype, let's say like wings of birds and butterflies. Those two things are both wings. This does not necessarily mean that birds and butterflies, just because they share this wing phenotype similarity, share the same evolutionary history. So we have to be careful in terms of how we look at the sharing of traits. The patterns of descent will tell us whether or not the sharing of traits is, let's say, homologous or analogous. And that's something we'll go over in just a second. Overall, what we can understand about these branching diagrams is very simple and straightforward. Branching diagrams not only represent evolutionary history, but because they represent these patterns of descent, they're going to also, we'll say as a general overall note, branching diagrams, phylogenetic trees, represents a hypothesis, something that we have a strong basis in understanding and have concrete proof for, represents a hypothesis, what we would consider through a series of dichotomies. And dichotomies is just a fancy word for a series of branching events, a series of splitting offs between different, let's say, species and organisms that show differing evolutionary history based off of the phylogenetic trees that we draw. So if we have this hypothesis based off of these dichotomies, these branching events, what can we put towards this phylogenetic tree? What can this phylogenetic tree truly tell us, and what does it contain, physically speaking, let's say, when we look at a phylogenetic tree? And again, this is a bit of a review, but it's important to understand the components of the tree, the physical components that are seen in almost nearly every good, let's say, phylogenetic tree. Components of tree. Most phylogenetic trees will contain several different nodes. So nodes, as you probably already know, are simply branch points. This is the start of a dichotomy, let's say. And as branch points, nodes will then, of course, represent what we would consider a divergence from a common ancestor. Two things are on the same path, and then let's say there's a divergence here, and then there's a divergence that way. Right over here is our common ancestor, but then we have this node that I'm bolding right over here, and that's showing a divergence of species A versus species B, which shared this common ancestor at this point in time. The divergence itself, the bolded area right here, is our node or our branch point. In addition, another important component of these phylogenetic trees are the establishment and understanding of sister taxa. Sister taxa are defined as groups of organisms that share an immediate common ancestor. That share immediate, that's the key word here. It has to be a quite recent and very, very similar, let's say, common ancestor. AKA the A and B right here. These are both sister taxa because they both share a quite immediate common ancestor right at that branch node point that we already drew. In addition to sister taxa, we can also understand that components of a tree may also include a rooted tree. So I'll do that down here. What is a rooted tree? A rooted tree is going to be a phylogenetic tree that has one branch point, and this is the key here. It's only one of these, one moment in time, one moment in the evolutionary history, one branch point that represents, again, all of these branches represent things. They represent patterns of descent, phylogenetic relationships, and evolutionary history. This rooted tree will have one branch point that represents most recent common ancestor. So we'll write that down. Most recent CA for common ancestor, if that's not already obvious. Most recent common ancestor of all the taxa on the tree. Of all the taxa on tree. Now, I can't really draw the rooted tree here, but at the end of our components, I will be giving a figure that you can refer to in your textbook that shows all of the components that we cover in a great visual format that it's I really encourage you to look at. In addition to the rooted tree, the sister taxa, and the nodes, there's also something called a basal taxon component of our tree. What is a basal taxon? So let's define this. A basal taxon may also be in a phylogenetic tree, and this is simply going to be a lineage that diverged early. Okay? A lineage that diverged early, very early on in the history that we're looking at, and we'll say specifically in the history of the group. The history of the group, meaning all the organisms represented on the phylogenetic tree. This basal taxon will typically be, and I'll put this as an extension over here, on branch near the common ancestor. Okay? And this will be much clearer once you look at the figure that I'll refer to at the end of this video. On branch near a common ancestor. So that's our basal taxon. Moving forward, we also have not necessarily components of tree, a component of a tree, but this is a characteristic of a tree, and that is the idea of a polytomic tree or polytomy. Polytomy is going to be when we have a tree in which the relationships, the evolutionary relationships, are not quite clear. Are not clear. And this is not good, actually. This is not something phylogeneticists would want or prefer, but it's good for you to understand because when you notice a polytomic tree, a tree that displays polytomy, you can say to yourself, this is a bad tree. This is not a good tree that shows true patterns of descent or a strong evolutionary historical relationship perspective of what's going on. The reason why these are not clear, the reason why these are bad trees are because of multiple sort of randomish branching. Okay, it's very easy to see once you look at a polytomic tree that this multiple branching and multiple common ancestors is a big mess and not good in terms of true phylogenetic study. Another component that you might notice on a tree are what we would consider extant species, not extinct, but extant species. Many species, let's say. These are all the species that are currently alive, and you can see and know when something is an extant species because these currently alive species will be at the tips of the branches. Over here, let's say A and B are both alive because they are at the tips. They are more recent, and thus they are currently alive. Finally, last two major components of a tree, mainly description components that are very important to understand, and I briefly mentioned them before, are the idea of something being homologous versus, of course, the idea of something being analogous. And both of these things can be represented and seen on a phylogenetic tree. If something is homologous, we would say that this trait that is being shown, this homologous trait, is similar due to a shared ancestry. There's a common ancestor somewhere. Similar due to shared ancestry. This is very, very important to understand that there is a common ancestor that is shared, and thus the trait is homologous. Classic example of this is, of course, that cat forelimb, the whale flipper, and the bat wing. Three random things, right? No, of course not. Those are truly a great example of homologous traits and characteristics because though they're from three totally different organisms, cat, whale, and bat, they all converge, they all combine in this homologous form and fashion to give us this shared ancestry of this four-limb structure that you can see in your textbook especially. Finally, analogous traits are those that are the result of convergent evolution. Okay, result of convergent evolution. This is not due to shared ancestry. This is an example that I gave prior, like how I said that branching diagram, this phylogenetic tree, is not always in line with phenotypic similarities. Classic example is when you have an analogous trait like wings, and wings, let's say in a bird versus wings in a butterfly, do not share a common ancestor. You do not share a recent common ancestor whatsoever. You have an insect versus a bird. Those two things are very, very different, and thus they converged on this idea of flight, but not on this idea of shared ancestry. So this is a result of convergent evolution, not the common ancestor that we see in homologous traits. So that covers classification 2. We went over the idea of a branching diagram representing this phylogenetic relationships. All of this is a nice hypothesis to represent branching points, dichotomies, and we have these many components of a tree. Finally, I highly suggest you look at figure 26.5 in your textbooks to really drive home all of these points that we mentioned about phylogenetic trees.